Today on the BetaFiles, Optimus Prime and G.I. Joe. Where'd they go? What happened? Hang on to your diapies, babies. I'm the barber. This is the BetaFiles. All right, so today we're going to talk about Transformers and G.I. Joe, and not in the way you probably think. This isn't going to be one of those retro style things. You probably already saw the Optic Poet for this week, where we talk about TV from our childhood, Gen X TV. And we talk at length about Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Thundercats, and all that good stuff. What we're going to talk about today kind of ties in with the last episode where I was talking about, or we were talking about masculinity, and how representation of strong paternal figures has kind of been taken out of childhood of child cartoons. I think the most recent one that I can think of that I know of, and I may be wrong, but the most recent one may be The Last Airbender, and the paternal figure of Roku, as when Aang gets into a philosophical corner, Roku shows up to kind of give him guidance and give him answers as to what he should or shouldn't do. But looking at Optimus Prime, and more specifically like Duke from G.I. Joe, what you have are two very strong paternal figures for Gen X kids that show a level-headed, compassionate approach to different things, and understanding the value of the team and not necessarily the value of themselves, if that makes sense. So they're very selfless. And being able to manage the team in ways that that shows more than just uber masculine leadership, if that makes sense. There's not a ton of testosterone there. I mean, you look at them, you look at both Optimus Prime and Duke, and these are masculine characters, but they're also compassionate. And like I said, and the other thing about them is that when they make mistakes, they own the mistakes. They are not, they don't have so big of an ego that they can't admit that they were wrong. And when we look at that, and we look at the character of Lion-O, and he has, of course, the paternal figure in, I can't remember the guy's name, but the one who sends them there. But when you look at Lion-O, he's trying to learn. He's trying to figure out how to be level-headed, not act on his emotions, and that kind of thing. And when we look at that idea of acting on your emotions, if you look at the villains of those cartoons, they're always acting on their emotions, and of course they fail. After they've acted on those emotions and gone after or tried to accomplish something that they're not able to accomplish. And they're doing it all off of just sheer emotion and negative reinforcement. And of course they fail. And the message that you're ultimately getting from those cartoons, if you look at the broader narrative of the story arcs, is level-headed approaches with sympathy towards the team, sympathy towards the relationships between yourself and the team, and keeping your emotions in check. All that leads to success. All of that leads to being able to manufacture progress, right? The other thing that I'm going to talk about a little bit is the idea of we'll go ahead and tackle a couple of things. Yes, they were aiming at selling toys, specifically to boys. We're going to come back to that here in a second. They had to get you roped in so that if you were hooked on the cartoon, you would want the toys. And if you bought more toys, then you would be hooked on the cartoon because you want to see how the toys worked. So those two things are obvious. But how do you keep those kids locked in? Well, one answer is you don't kill the bad guy. And one thing about Transformers, both Transformers and G.I. Joe in the early seasons, and this is pre-Transformer movie, but in those early seasons, the thing is that nobody dies in the episodes. And they have epic battles, right? And you know, like legendary battles. But there are some that there are a few episodes where different characters get injured to the point where, you know, they're kind of like knocked out of action for a hot minute, but they don't die. Nobody's getting killed. And that's the other thing that you kind of take away from these early cartoons. The bad guys, even though they're acting off emotion, even though they're trying to progress these wildly negative versions of themselves, they don't die. They just kind of they retreat, they go back, and they come up with some other plan to thwart the good guys, right? But again, they're acting off their emotions, and the good guys are there to stop them, right? It's a basic, you could say it's a basic good and evil dynamic, but I think with the Transformers, G.I. Joe is very simplistic. Cobra is a terrorist organization, and G.I. Joe is created to stop them. They're like the special squad that's sole purpose is to make sure that the terrorist organization known as Cobra doesn't succeed. With the Transformers, what you have is a power struggle between two factions for one object, and that object being Cybertron. Who's going to rule Cybertron? Of course, the Decepticons represent the fascist ideal, the totalitarian state, whereas the Autobots represent democracy and goodwill, right? And the Autobots are always fighting from behind. They're always trying to catch up. Whereas the Decepticons, they've got their foothold on Cybertron. And it's not until the Transformers movie that we see the balance finally shift in the Autobots' favor. But those first 3 seasons before the animated movie, and I'm going to be talking about the movie. When I talk about the movie in this episode, I'm talking about the animated movie. I'm not talking about the Michael Bay films or the Bumblebee film. This is the original cartoon movie, which was in line with the television series. And what we see in the series pre-movie is nobody dies. Even when what they end up doing is they bring other Transformers back from prison, and the prison is actually what they did was they took their core and just put it in a box and locked it up. So even then they're not even doing capital punishment. But then, and this is what's really interesting about it is when you look at the narratives that Transformers and G.I. Joe sets up for these boys back in the 80s. And these are boy cartoons. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But what you see are these narratives where, and you get the boys so used to solving problems without death, without just killing something, that when you get to the first 5 minutes of the Transformers movie, Megatron kills Ironhide. And you see him do it, and it's a shock. It's a shock, not just because you've seen Ironhide die, who was like Optimus Prime's number 2. It's a shock because, wait a minute, for the past 3 seasons of cartoons, nobody has died, and you just killed him. And then, of course, the next half hour of the movie is just basically Hasbro killing off portions of the toy line on the screen, right? But of course, to somebody who's 9 or 10 years old, you're invested in this story, in this narrative, and you're seeing these characters die. These characters who have seemingly been able to outlive all kinds of horrendous, and there's the new. It's ferocious. It's not horrendous. It's not ferocious. It's ferocious. These ferocious battles with these people, with these other guys. And so there's actually a positive message to those early years before the Transformer movie. The G.I. Joe movie is not as devastating as the Transformers movie was. The way they got rid of Cobra Commander was he was cursed and literally became a snake. And then you had the rise of Serpentor. And Serpentor just basically brings in a new bureau. What you see is an administration change. And he brings in his people over the Cobra people. And of course, with that, you have new specialty guys that come up through the ranks in G.I. Joe who kind of take over, and you see Duke and Flint's roles kind of diminish a little bit. But before all that, in those early years, if you look at it, the male leading figures of both of those series, with Optimus Prime, and then, like I said, with Duke, especially with Duke, they are, again, just level-headed, compassionate. They own their mistakes. When they make mistakes, they own it. Everything is for the team, not for themselves. There's no ego, and they do not react to emotions immediately. So it's not a knee-jerk reaction. They think about things. They do get angry, but you can tell they keep their anger in check. And these are positives. These are tremendously positive things. So what happened? What happened that, the only, in the past 20 years that I know of, the only figure that kind of represents that same style of masculinity, this not necessarily brute style masculinity, but this level-headed masculinity that we see in those cartoons, is Roku from The Last Airbender. And I say that because my daughter, recently, the thing is the old Pokemon series, which was big when my boys were younger. And with the Pokemon series, there's this kind of like older, wiser character, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken. But he has a more diminished role. If we look at Fairly Odd Parents, the father is a parody. If we look at SpongeBob SquarePants, Mr. Krabs represents the paternal figure of that show, and he is a parody. And so when we look at it, the idea of that, for some reason, the idea of this well-balanced male figure is gone. And I think that that's bad, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and talk about the politics. And of course, the thing back in Transformers had to deal with the problem of Transformers had to deal with the problem, or dealt with the problem of not enough female representation in their cartoons by introducing RC, the token girl. And we started to see that more and more. Now, the interesting thing about G.I. Joe is they had the token girl too, but they actually had two of them. They had Scarlet and Lady Jane, and then, of course, on the opposite side in Cobra, they had the Baroness. So you did have those female characters, but they were pretty much stereotypes. And RC becomes a stereotype because, again, she's token, right? And same thing with Turtles. April O'Neil is the token girl. The interesting thing about April O'Neil is that there were times where she was able to manipulate the system for the Turtles, which showed a little bit of power and journalism. I don't know. You could probably do a whole thesis on why April O'Neil is important to the Turtles. But just looking at the surface of it, she's just a token girl. And then if you look at the Thundercats, Chitara is a token girl, right? I think when we look at boys cartoons, the only one that was actually successful at starting out as a token girl but then actually growing is She-Ra. So of course, if you're going through this cultural moment that we're going through, we could obviously rip into this and talk about how much injustice this is, right? And how horribly bad it is that the Transformers had a girl in the entire time that the original series was on. And she doesn't come in until the movie. It's the movie that you first see RC. This is why that bothers me. Because it bothers me a lot. And it's not because, you're saying that something that I love was really bad. At this point, as an Xer, I'm used to it because most of the stuff that we grew up loving we have been told that it's bad. That it's misogynistic. I'm sure at some point they're going to talk about how horribly misogynistic Kurt Cobain was. It's just a matter of time. Even though he showed up on the cover of The Advocate, even though Territorial Pissings is all about women's rights, and even though Polly is a wonderful story of a girl who gets trapped and she's able to feign Stockholm Syndrome to get out from underneath this guy's clutches. He did all that. I'm sure some way, somehow, they're going to talk about how Kurt Cobain was misogynistic. Because they've told us everything else that we know and love is misogynistic. But here's why I have a problem with that argument with the Transformers and G.I. Joe. During the 1980s, when Transformers and G.I. Joe came out, yes, they were boy cartoons. And these cartoons, we'll come back to that. At the same time that Transformers G.I. Joe is becoming popular, toy makers realize we got to get the girls. And actually, He-Man is the first one to become popular, the He-Man action figures, and you start to see them all rethinking the doll market. And as Jay and I noted, when we were kids, we had dolls, but they were called action figures, and they were not necessarily dolls, but they're dolls. I mean, anybody, if an alien came to planet Earth and you held up a G.I. Joe beside a Barbie, it would be the same thing to the alien. But what the toy makers did was they realized, okay, Barbie's not going to be enough. And so, several different lines came out, and of course, one of them was, two of them that I can think of right off the top of my head is Rainbow Bright and My Little Pony, the original My Little Pony. And we're going to talk about the newer My Little Pony in a minute. But the original My Little Pony. And even with the Care Bears, okay? You get the Care Bears too. Now, the Care Bears, you had male and females, right? And with the Smurfs, you had mostly male, and then you had the one Smurfette, right? The token girl. But with My Little Pony, it's largely an all-female cast. With Jim, the rock star, right? She's in an all-girl band, and her main competitors is another all-girl band. And you have a couple of males in gym, but they're not as prominent and not as popular and not as powerful in the narrative as Jim and the Holograms or the Misfits, right? And the same thing kind of goes for well, no, that's not true. Never mind. So I'll skip that one. But you see that there were things that were tailored straight for girls. And the reason why I have a problem with this, and of course the knee-jerk reaction to that would be, well, yeah, there were more boy cartoons out there. They were making more boy toys, right? Standing in a marketing, if you look at it from a marketing perspective, it is a lot easier to make toys for boys than it is to make toys for girls because of social constructs of gender. Now, obviously, that has started to erode away. For good or bad, whatever side of the argument you're on, that has started to erode away. But back then, in the 1980s, it was largely a boys' market. And the girls had very few options, but it's not like they didn't have any options at all. And that's one of the problems with the argument is it's almost like the girls were being just completely and utterly shut out of the conversation. But if you look at the girl cartoons versus the boy cartoons are focused on developing a generic role of manhood that is, again, level-headed, compassionate, admits when they're wrong, owns the mistake, works with the team to obtain a shared goal. Ego is put on the back burner. Team is first, I am second, right? There's no I in team. And I don't think that's wrong. And I think if you've got cartoons that are telling children that, and they're establishing those ideas of positive male attitudes, of positive male models, of positive male action, then there's nothing wrong with it being targeted just towards boys. I think that's that is the necessary that has to happen to get that positive. Can you have a equally diverse cartoon that teaches both the positive role male model and the positive female model? I don't know. I don't know if you can. Because you risk seeing what happened with Timmy Turner and SpongeBob SquarePants and Jimmy Neutron. His dad is a parody, which is kind of necessary because, well, it's not necessary. His dad could have been they could have gone in a different vein with his dad, but he becomes a parody. And I think what happened was in the late 80s and on into the 90s, as PC culture started to really build steam, and this idea of toxic masculinity, the fear of programming toxic masculinity inadvertently led to a misunderstanding of what the messages actually were that were coming out of the cartoons. Because one of the arguments is that these cartoons are promoting male aggression. the reality is that the male aggression in those cartoons are coming from the bad guys, who again are working off of immediate reactions to negative emotions, right? And just feeding off of emotion and negative emotion and this nonstop desire to achieve everything and focusing on the ego and less on the collective. Whereas the good guys who win in all the episodes, who make progress in each episode, are using violence in a defensive stance to defend themselves. They're not using it in a overly masculine way. And they're promoting the betterment of the team through managing emotions, through owning mistakes, and through compassion. And that's what, when we look at the two big ones, Duke and Optimus Prime, that's what they stand for. And we often, you can easily go down that slope of, truth, justice, and the American way, which, by the way, not next week, but the week after, I'm going to be doing the same kind of talk about Superman. What happened, right? So I think what by not focusing on that, I think it exposes what is happening right now in our current culture. We're seeing it happen again, only on a much larger and much more dangerous scale, where we're reacting before we're asking questions, and we're not looking at the positives that may be coming out of a specific group. We're just focusing on the negatives and only the negatives, and the negatives trump everything, right? And I think that's a huge mistake, because you have an entire generation of young men my age, or in my age group, that more than likely got some of their social awareness from Transformers and G.I. Joe and Thundercats and Voltron, where there was a paternal figure that guided the rest of the group. And that paternal figure, again, did not react emotionally, was cool-headed, level-headed. If he did react emotionally and made a mistake, he owned his mistake and he did what he could to fix it. There was always forgiveness. And the negative aspects of those cartoons, we have the bad guys that never achieve anything because they're doing the exact opposite that these larger paternal figures are doing. And so you can be masculine and be gentle, and you can be a leader and be tough and strong and be level-headed and check your emotions. And it's a very interesting. It's very interesting that we've kind of ditched that concept because of toxic masculinity, that anything that promotes any kind of masculinity is toxic. And I think that's a dangerous slide. So when we look, here's the thing. The reality that we have to eventually come to when it comes to this kind of thing, when we talk about masculinity, we have to understand the reality that men have more testosterone than women do. Biologically, we have more testosterone. When you have more testosterone, you do have more aggression. Now, if you don't want that to be the case, then you're going to have to genetically engineer every child that is conceived from here on out, because it's not going to change unless you mess with it. Understanding that and separating that from social gender roles is the first step to understanding how we can change social gender roles. But you've got to stop and realize that there are benefits to masculinity that toxic masculinity has nothing to do with. That is separate. And there is nothing wrong with admitting that there are some things that men are better adapt biologically to doing than women. And there are things on this planet where women are biologically built to be better than men. Understanding that doesn't mean that you have gone down the misogynist rabbit hole into the alt-right. What that means is accepting biology, accepting reality. Understanding that separate from social gender norms and getting that and understanding that base then can lead to discussions about, okay, now what do we do with these social gender norms that have been built on these presumptions that because men have more testosterone, they're better at job A? How do we fix that? How do we make it more diverse? And I think the answer to diversity is, number one, stop trying to force diversity. Number two, change the conversation by separating social gender norms from biological genders. Because biological genders, you can't deny the biological differences between a male and a female. You can argue the merits of specific jobs in the social norm. You can change the way men and women interact by understanding how they're going to interact biologically. And I think that's important to understand in order to get to this question of social norms and how we can change them, and how we need to change. We need to change the social norms. They need to be changed. This is not new, but you can't change those until you recognize the fact that you have to separate the biological, the understanding of the biological male and female from social norms. We've got to make that separation. We got to make that clear that this is what men are biologically built to be good at. This is what women are biologically built to be good at. Let's start there. And then we'll talk about, okay, how do we socially adapt those things? And how do we open up possibilities that we haven't had before for both sexes, right? For male and female. Because then I think we'll once we do that, we can look back as a culture. We can look back at those cartoons from the 1980s and see them in the light, not as they were uber violent and they only were tailored to get boys to buy toys. Although that is the driving force, but the other driving force is you got to get the boys to keep tuning in. And so you create a narrative that just happens to be very positive in its message about male role models. And you have two very strong, very good men represented in Optimus Prime and Duke. Just by the way they carry themselves, by the way they interact with people, by the way they interact with their own ego and by the way they interact with their team. And how, again, they keep the biggest thing that I got from both of those cartoons, they kept their emotions in check. And it went right along with the message we were getting from Mr. Rogers, who was saying, keep your emotions in check. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to stomp your foot. But keep it in check. It's okay to feel. It's what you do with your feelings, right? And that's kind of what we learned from those cartoons. Subliminally, right? On the surface, we're learning how to transform that toy we just bought. So, but I think, so to answer the question that I posed at the beginning and what's in the title, what happened to Optimus Prime and G.I. Joe? They're one of the casualties of a PC culture that needs to be rechecked. And maybe once we slow this down and we start using our brains, we won't have stories. We won't have a national newspaper destroy some woman's life because of a mistake she made 2 years ago that she's already paid the price for by being humiliated and embarrassed at the party. And now 2 years later, drag her up and you throw her on the front of the style section of the Washington Post and destroy her life. Maybe it's time to go back and learn from the different cartoons that we watched in the 80s. Maybe it's time to go back and look at them. Maybe it's time to actually take My Little Pony Friendship is Forever seriously. Or the Tinkerbell movies seriously. Because you don't see cancel culture in those shows. When an Autobot makes a mistake, Optimus Prime doesn't run him off. Hell, even when a Decepticon makes a mistake. I mean, Starscream made mistake after mistake after mistake, and Megatron kept him around till the movie. I mean, come on. Is that where we're getting as a culture? That we're going to ruin some poor, unknown woman over a mistake she made a couple years ago at a party that she has already apologized for, that she has already owned up to, that she was already humiliated enough. You're going to pull her out on the cover of the style section of the Washington Post and destroy her life. No. Yo Joe, right? The Washington Post, real American hero for the left. All right. On speaking of the media, the next episode we're going to talk about gun control as part of the Hate Machine series. So we're not going to be talking about whether guns are good or bad. We're going to talk about how the national media has completely ruined any chances for a conversation about guns. All right. So until then, make it a great day. Don't forget to catch Optic Poet is every Tuesday on YouTube and on the podcasts. Text messages from the living room are every Wednesday. Now See This Here Now Then is every Thursday. Now See This Here Now Then is not a podcast, but you can catch it on YouTube and Instagram. You can catch text messages from the living room on YouTube and Instagram, and coming to the podcast soon. Like I said, I'm working on the older episodes so I can get them lined up, and then you'll see just a huge dump of text messages. from the living room. And you can get all of this on our blog site, www.thebetafiles.com. All right. So, as I said, make it a great day. Remember, if the sun comes up, there's opportunities to take it. Be kind to one another. Please. I'm the barber. This has been the Beta Files.